The parking lot is almost empty, washed in pale fluorescent light, while a security camera quietly records everything without judgment or mercy. A young woman walks into the frame, pauses for a moment, and then disappears into the darkness beyond its reach. No one knows it yet, but this is the last confirmed image of Tiffany Whitton. How does a small theft inside a Georgia jewelry store turn into a permanent disappearance? What begins as a moment of panic quickly becomes an unsolved mystery, a quiet cold case shaped by fear, control, and decisions made in seconds. This case carries a dark past of domestic violence, emotional dependence, and an environment where silence felt safer than truth. It is not merely the story of a missing woman, it is a psychological portrait of a mind under pressure, choosing flight over confrontation. Tonight, we examine the victim, the setting, and the unseen forces that shaped the silence that followed. Small towns in Georgia often project a reassuring image of stability. They are places where routines repeat daily, where faces are familiar, and where the absence of visible danger is mistaken for genuine safety. The streets appear calm, businesses close on time, and family life seems orderly from the outside. This environment creates the impression that serious harm cannot easily take root. Yet criminological research has long shown that violence does not require chaos to exist. In fact, emotionally volatile environments often thrive where disruption is least expected. In small communities, problems are not absent. They are simply quieter. Conflict rarely spills into public spaces. Instead, it becomes contained, normalized, and slowly absorbed into everyday life. In such towns, social closeness can become a paradox. Everyone knows one another, but no one truly intervenes. Familiarity discourages suspicion. Stability discourages inquiry. When tension appears, it is often explained away as a temporary disagreement or a private matter best left alone. This cultural reflex becomes a protective shield for harmful behavior. Domestic violence researchers frequently describe this pattern as invisible escalation. Abuse does not always arrive with bruises or police reports. It often begins with control disguised as concern, jealousy framed as love, and emotional monitoring justified as protection. These behaviors rarely trigger alarm in environments conditioned to avoid conflict. Within this setting lived Tiffany Whitton, a young woman whose life already showed signs of fragility long before her disappearance. She did not have steady employment, and her economic independence was limited. Financial instability alone does not determine vulnerability, but it significantly narrows a person's perceived options when stress intensifies. Psychological studies consistently indicate that individuals without financial or social autonomy are more likely to tolerate unhealthy relationships. Dependence reshapes risk assessment. Leaving becomes not just emotionally painful, but practically frightening. Survival begins to feel tied to maintaining the relationship, regardless of its cost. Tiffany's sense of stability was closely bound to her romantic relationship. For many people in similar situations, emotional attachment becomes a substitute for security, identity, and direction. When other anchors are missing, relationships carry disproportionate psychological weight. They become lifelines rather than partnerships. Those who knew Tiffany described her as someone longing for an ordinary life. She wanted independence, predictability, and freedom from scrutiny. This desire is psychologically significant. It suggests internal conflict between autonomy and attachment, a tension often seen in individuals experiencing controlling relationships. Control does not always appear aggressive. It often presents as guidance, supervision, or concern. Over time, however, it narrows personal space. Decisions become monitored. Social circles shrink. Autonomy erodes quietly. Victims begin to question their own judgment, gradually deferring to the controlling partner's perspective. At the center of Tiffany's emotional environment was her boyfriend, a man with a documented history of domestic violence. Such histories are critical indicators in criminal psychology, not because they predict inevitable escalation, but because they reveal established behavioral patterns. Men with prior domestic violence records often exhibit traits associated with coercive control. These include possessiveness, emotional volatility, hypersensitivity to perceived rejection, and an intense need to dominate relational narratives. Control becomes a method of stabilizing their own internal insecurity. Psychologically, this behavior is frequently linked to fragile self-esteem, masked by authority. The individual fears abandonment, loss of relevance, or humiliation. Rather than addressing these fears internally, control is exerted externally. The partner becomes both a source of validation and a perceived threat. When control is challenged, stress responses intensify. Emotional regulation deteriorates. This is not always expressed through immediate physical violence. More often, it manifests through intimidation, manipulation, surveillance, and isolation. The environment becomes psychologically constricting rather than overtly dangerous. For victims, prolonged exposure to such dynamics alters perception. Fear becomes habitual rather than exceptional. Emotional tension becomes background noise. Over time, the nervous system adapts. Hypervigilance replaces clarity. Decision-making becomes reactive rather than reflective. One of the most damaging psychological effects of coercive control is the erosion of perceived escape routes. Victims begin to believe that leaving will result in greater harm than staying. This belief is reinforced by past reactions, threats, or emotional punishments delivered when independence is asserted. In this mental state, responsibility becomes distorted. Victims often internalize the belief that they are responsible for maintaining emotional equilibrium in the relationship. Conflict avoidance becomes a survival strategy. Silence becomes protection. Tiffany's broader environment reinforced this silence. In many small communities, domestic conflict is framed as a private issue. Intervention is often viewed as inappropriate interference. Neighbors may notice tension but choose distance. Families may recognize warning signs but hope issues resolve on their own. This collective non-intervention is not born of malice. It is born of discomfort. Addressing domestic violence requires confrontation, moral clarity, and sustained involvement. Small communities often lack both the resources and the cultural framework to engage effectively. Criminologists refer to this as diffused responsibility. When everyone knows something is wrong, no one feels individually accountable to act. Warning signs become normalized. The absence of public crises reinforces the illusion that the situation is under control. Over time, silence becomes structural. Family secrets persist. Psychological harm deepens. When a breaking point finally arrives, it appears sudden, only because the build-up occurred in private, unseen, and unaddressed. By the time Tiffany entered the jewelry store in Georgia in 2013, her psychological landscape had already been shaped by instability, fear, and constrained choice. The act that followed was not random. It emerged from accumulated stress, diminished options, and a mind conditioned to flee rather than confront. In criminal psychology, such moments are described as threshold events. They are not causes, but catalysts. They activate responses that have been forming long before the visible incident occurs. What followed inside that store cannot be understood without acknowledging the silent pressures that preceded it. The theft was not an isolated lapse in judgment. It was the surface expression of deeper psychological strain. Before everything fell apart, there was already fracture. Before disappearance, there was already erasure. And before silence, there was a life shaped by fear long before anyone noticed it was there. On the day of the incident, Tiffany Whitton was not psychologically alone, even when she later appeared physically by herself. Earlier that day, she had been in the presence of her boyfriend, a detail that would later draw significant attention from investigators and behavioral analysts. In relationships marked by control, proximity itself can intensify internal pressure. Surveillance does not require constant physical presence. It persists cognitively, shaping thought and behavior long after the partner is out of sight. Research in domestic abuse psychology consistently shows that victims often carry an internalized observer. Decisions are filtered through anticipated reactions. Anxiety becomes anticipatory rather than reactive. For someone like Tiffany, this meant that even ordinary situations could trigger heightened stress, particularly when she believed her actions might be judged, punished, or misinterpreted. In the hours leading up to the theft, Tiffany's behavior did not align with patterns typically associated with professional or habitual theft. There was no evidence of preparation, coordination, or exit planning. Instead, her actions suggested emotional dysregulation. Studies on stress-induced impulsivity demonstrate that individuals under sustained psychological strain often act in ways that contradict their long-term interests, prioritizing immediate emotional relief over rational calculation. The jewelry store in Georgia where the incident occurred was not a fortified or heavily monitored environment. This fact matters because it reduces the likelihood that Tiffany was testing security or executing a deliberate criminal plan. Opportunistic theft under psychological distress often occurs in low-resistance settings. where the act itself feels momentarily empowering or distracting. For individuals experiencing chronic control, small acts of defiance can feel psychologically significant. They are not about material gain. They are about reclaiming agency, even briefly. This phenomenon is well documented in trauma psychology, where impulsive acts emerge as attempts to restore a sense of autonomy that has been systematically eroded. When store employees noticed the theft and contacted law enforcement, the psychological landscape shifted immediately. For most individuals, police involvement represents accountability. For someone in Tiffany's position, it symbolized exposure. Exposure to authority, exposure to judgment, exposure to consequences that extended far beyond the store. Victims of controlling relationships often fear institutional involvement more than the abusive partner. This fear is rooted in experience. Reporting can escalate retaliation. Public attention can provoke further control. The arrival of police represented not just legal risk, but relational danger. Witnesses later reported that Tiffany panicked. Panic is frequently misunderstood as exaggerated fear. In neurological terms, it is a loss of executive function. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for reasoning and planning, becomes overwhelmed. Control shifts to the amygdala, prioritizing survival responses. Logic collapses. Time compresses. The future disappears. In such moments, individuals do not evaluate outcomes. They react. The brain selects from three primary responses: fight, flight, or freeze. For Tiffany, the response was flight. This choice was not strategic. It was automatic. Instead of waiting for law enforcement, Tiffany ran. She exited the store and moved into the surrounding area. From an external perspective, this decision appeared irrational. From a psychological perspective, it was consistent with acute stress response patterns observed in trauma survivors. Flight responses are especially common among individuals who have learned that confrontation leads to punishment. Running becomes safer than explaining. Disappearing becomes preferable to facing authority. In this state, survival is measured in seconds, not consequences. After leaving the store, Tiffany did not return home. This fact marked the transition from incident to disappearance. Hours passed without contact, then days. Family members and acquaintances grew concerned. Eventually, a missing person report was filed. At this stage, investigators faced a difficult challenge. There was no confirmed destination, no communication trail, and no evidence suggesting voluntary disappearance. Unlike planned runaways, Tiffany left without resources, preparation, or support. Her boyfriend's behavior in the aftermath drew additional scrutiny. Reports indicated inconsistencies in his statements and a lack of proactive cooperation. While such behavior does not establish guilt, behavioral science recognizes it as a potential red flag within abusive relational contexts. Individuals involved in coercive dynamics often respond to crises with self-preservation. Their primary concern is narrative control. They may minimize, redirect, or withhold information to protect their own position. This behavior can stem from fear, guilt, or a learned reliance on manipulation. Importantly, suspicion does not equal conclusion. Investigators did not have sufficient evidence to formally charge or arrest. However, the behavioral inconsistencies complicated the investigative process and contributed to public doubt. Despite search efforts, no physical evidence emerged. There were no confirmed sightings, no belongings were recovered, no credible leads surfaced beyond the store's parking area. Surveillance footage provided limited context, ending before revealing Tiffany's trajectory after she fled. The absence of data is one of the most destabilizing elements in missing person cases. Without physical traces, investigators must rely on psychological reconstruction. This method involves examining relationships, stressors, and behavioral patterns rather than concrete proof. Criminal psychologists refer to this stage as inferential investigation. It is where theories replace facts, and probability substitutes certainty. In Tiffany's case, the lack of evidence amplified every possibility without confirming any. Was she attempting to escape immediate danger and encountered harm? Did she seek temporary refuge and miscalculate risk? Did another individual intervene, intentionally or accidentally? Each hypothesis carried psychological plausibility, yet none could be substantiated. What transformed this case from a shoplifting incident into a haunting mystery was not the theft itself, but the silence that followed. Silence from evidence, silence from witnesses, silence from answers. Investigators were left confronting a blurred boundary between victimhood and circumstance. Tiffany was both a person under psychological strain and a missing individual whose choices placed her at risk. This duality complicated public perception and investigative framing. The unresolved question persisted: was the theft the origin of the disappearance, or merely the trigger that activated a far more dangerous sequence of events already in motion? In criminal psychology, such cases resist closure because they expose uncomfortable truths. Not all disappearances are the result of single acts. Some are the culmination of invisible pressures, compounded until one moment collapses the entire structure. Tiffany Whitton's disappearance remains unresolved, not because investigators stopped looking, but because the critical answers may have vanished with her. What remains is a question suspended between fear and fate, waiting for evidence that may never surface. From the earliest moments after Tiffany's disappearance, the direction of the investigation was shaped by a critical assumption, one that would quietly influence every decision that followed. Law enforcement initially framed the event through the lens of a minor property crime. Tiffany's flight from the store was interpreted as an act of voluntary avoidance, a conscious attempt to evade legal consequences rather than a signal of distress. This framing, subtle yet decisive, delayed a broader examination of her emotional state, personal relationships, and potential vulnerability. Criminal psychologists have long warned that early assumptions can narrow investigative vision. Once a case is categorized runaway, avoidance, or voluntary disappearance, contradictory evidence is often unconsciously discounted. In Tiffany's case, the theft became the anchor point, and her disappearance was treated as an extension of that act, rather than a rupture demanding urgent scrutiny. This approach is particularly problematic in cases involving domestic violence. Unlike physical abuse, psychological coercion leaves no visible marks. Yet research consistently shows that emotional control, intimidation, and chronic fear can profoundly impair decision-making. Victims may flee suddenly, irrationally, or without resources, not because they are planning an escape, but because their nervous system is reacting to perceived danger. According to experts in trauma psychology, such behavior is frequently misread by outsiders as irresponsibility or guilt, when in fact it is a survival response. By treating Tiffany's actions as deliberate avoidance, investigators overlooked a crucial possibility: that she was not exercising free choice at all. No formal suspect was ever publicly named. While individuals close to Tiffany were questioned, including her boyfriend, no arrests were made. From an evidentiary standpoint, the case quickly encountered familiar obstacles. There was no confirmed crime scene beyond the store, no recovered body, no digital trail conclusively mapping her movements after she fled. In the absence of physical evidence, investigative options narrowed, and the case gradually cooled. This pattern is not uncommon. Studies of missing person investigations show that cases lacking immediate forensic anchors often lose momentum within weeks. Resources are redirected, leads grow stale, and the passage of time itself becomes an adversary. As days turned into months, Tiffany's disappearance receded from active pursuit into unresolved limbo. Media coverage followed a similar trajectory. Local outlets reported the incident briefly, presenting it as a puzzling but limited story, without dramatic visuals, confirmed foul play, or official escalation. National attention never materialized. Media scholars note that sustained coverage is often what transforms a missing person case from a local concern into a priority. In Tiffany's case, that amplification never occurred. As headlines faded, so did public pressure. Online spaces, however, told a different story. On social media forums and comment threads, speculation flourished. Users scrutinized the behavior of Tiffany's boyfriend, dissecting past statements, timelines, and perceived inconsistencies. In the absence of official clarity, public suspicion rushed in to fill the void. This phenomenon, sometimes called crowdsourced investigation, can generate useful tips, but it can also distort reality, amplifying rumor over evidence. For Tiffany's family, the consequences were devastating. They endured not only the agony of not knowing what happened to their loved one, but also the weight of public judgment. Families of missing persons are often described by trauma specialists as secondary victims. They carry grief without closure and are frequently subjected to suspicion, blame, or invasive questioning. Every unanswered question becomes an open wound. As time passed, several theories emerged, each attempting to impose order on uncertainty. The first theory suggested that Tiffany fled in panic and later died accidentally. According to this view, disorientation, exhaustion, or exposurist, especially in unfamiliar terrain, could have led to fatal consequences without the involvement of another person. Search and rescue experts acknowledged that individuals under acute stress can make dangerously irrational choices, traveling farther than expected or failing to seek help even when it is available. A second theory centered on domestic violence escalation. Research in criminology indicates that moments of external interventions, such as police involvement or public exposure, can intensify controlling behavior in abusive relationships. If a confrontation occurred after the theft, it could have escalated rapidly. Domestic violence homicides often follow periods of heightened stress, perceived loss of control, or threats to an abuser's authority. Yet without physical evidence or witnesses, this theory remains speculative. A third theory proposed third-party involvement. Vulnerable individuals fleeing alone are statistically at higher risk of encountering opportunistic offenders. Criminologists note that predators often exploit moments of chaos, targeting those who appear disoriented, fearful, or isolated. This explanation accounted for the suddenness of Tiffany's disappearance, but again, lacked concrete proof. Each theory aligned with established behavioral patterns, lending it surface credibility, yet none could be definitively confirmed or ruled out. One unresolved factor quietly weakened every explanation: time. The unclear interval between events concealed critical moments where decisions, encounters, or escalation may have irrevocably altered the outcome. The precise window between Tiffany fleeing the store and vanishing entirely remains unresolved. Minutes, hours, or longer, this uncertainty is not trivial. In criminal psychology, temporal gaps often conceal decisive turning points. What happens immediately after a triggering event frequently determines outcomes. Did she encounter someone? Did she return somewhere familiar? Did she pause, hesitate, or seek help? As investigators revisited the timeline, doubts resurfaced. The early assumption of voluntary avoidance now appeared increasingly fragile. Something essential had been missed, not necessarily a single clue, but a shift in perspective. Without understanding Tiffany's psychological state in that critical window, every theory remained incomplete. In the end, the case illustrates a broader truth about missing person investigations. When behavior is interpreted without context, especially in the presence of trauma or coercion, the risk of misjudgment is high. Psychological abuse may leave no physical trace, but its influence can be decisive, shaping actions in ways that appear illogical to those on the outside. Until the missing time is accounted for, the truth of what happened to Tiffany remains just beyond reach, hidden not by lack of concern, but by the quiet power of early assumptions left unchallenged. From a psychological standpoint, Tiffany's actions are most coherently understood through the lens of trauma-driven behavior rather than rational choice. Decades of research in clinical psychology demonstrate that individuals subjected to prolonged psychological or emotional abuse often function in a chronic state of survival. In such conditions, decision-making is no longer guided by long-term reasoning or consequence evaluation, but by immediate threat assessment. Fear becomes the organizing principle of behavior. Trauma specialists emphasize that abuse reshapes the nervous system. According to trauma theory, particularly the work of researchers such as Judith Herman and Bessel van der Kolk, repeated exposure to intimidation or coercion conditions the brain to anticipate danger even in ambiguous situations. The body reacts before the mind has time to interpret events logically. For victims, survival is not a conscious strategy, it is an automatic state. Within this framework, Tiffany's decision to flee does not suggest guilt, recklessness, or planning. Instead, it aligns with a well-documented trauma response. The classic fight, flight, or freeze mechanism becomes deeply ingrained in individuals who live under sustained threat. When confronted with authority, confrontation, or exposure such as police presence or public scrutiny, the nervous system can respond as if facing imminent harm. Flight, in this context, is not escape from responsibility, but escape from perceived danger. Psychologists note that trauma responses are often misunderstood because they appear disproportionate to the immediate trigger. To an outside observer, the theft may seem minor. To someone conditioned by fear, however, the event may symbolize loss of control, exposure, or retaliation. The fear does not arise from the act itself, but from what the act might provoke. Tiffany's reaction fits squarely within this model. Control dynamics are central to understanding this behavior. In abusive relationships, control is rarely maintained through physical force alone. More often, it is sustained through psychological mechanisms: intimidation, unpredictability, emotional withdrawal, and the implicit threat of consequences. Over time, victims learn that resistance, disclosure, or deviation from expected behavior results in punishment, sometimes overt, sometimes subtle, but equally effective. As a result, silence becomes a learned survival strategy. Victims internalize the belief that compliance equals safety, while speaking out equals danger. This conditioning erodes autonomy and distorts risk perception. Actions that appear illogically: running without resources, avoiding help, disappearing, often make sense within the internal logic of fear. For perpetrators, silence serves a different function. Experts in coercive control, such as Evan Stark, describe silence as a tool of power. Withholding information, minimizing concern, or remaining emotionally detached allows control over both the narrative and the victim's identity. When a victim disappears, ambiguity can become a shield. The absence of clear answers prevents accountability while sustaining dominance over interpretation. This asymmetry, fear-driven action on one side, strategic silence on the other, creates a psychological imbalance that complicates investigations. Traditional law enforcement methods are often ill-equipped to detect these dynamics because they rely heavily on visible evidence. Trauma, however, leaves patterns rather than proof. It shapes behavior, timing, and response, not necessarily physical traces. Beyond psychology, philosophical frameworks offer additional insight into how such situations unfold and why they are so often misunderstood. In Buddhist thought, fear is understood as arising from attachment. Attachment to safety, belonging, approval, or escape creates suffering when those conditions are threatened. From this perspective, Tiffany's fear did not originate in the theft itself, but in what the theft endangered: her fragile sense of security. The panic response reflects the collapse of perceived refuge. When the illusion of safety dissolves, fear surges. This interpretation does not assign blame to the individual, but instead highlights impermanence and vulnerability. Fear is not a moral failing. It is a human response to perceived loss. Tiffany's actions, viewed through this lens, become an expression of attachment under threat rather than irrationality. Christian ethical thought introduces a different dimension: moral responsibility within silence. Many theologians argue that silence in the face of injustice constitutes complicity. Abuse does not persist solely because of perpetrators, but because communities, institutions, and observers fail to intervene. When warning signs are ignored, suffering becomes normalized. From this perspective, the absence of decisive action by individuals, systems, or society reflects collective failure rather than individual weakness. The ethical burden does not rest solely on the victim's choices, but on the structures that allowed fear to remain unseen and unaddressed. Confucian philosophy further expands the analysis by emphasizing relational responsibility. Harmony, in Confucian ethics, is often prioritized over confrontation. While this value promotes social stability, it can also suppress truth when maintaining appearances becomes more important than protecting the vulnerable. In such environments, injustice persists quietly, shielded by politeness and avoidance. When fear is minimized to preserve harmony, victims are effectively sacrificed for social order. Tiffany's disappearance can be read as a consequence of this imbalance, where discomfort is avoided and suffering is absorbed by the most vulnerable person in the system. These philosophical perspectives converge at a critical point. Tiffany's disappearance cannot be understood as an isolated event. It exists at the intersection of individual trauma, relational dysfunction, and societal avoidance. Each layer reinforces the others, creating conditions where fear is misinterpreted, silence is normalized, and responsibility is diffused. If the case remains unresolved, behavioral science suggests that progress is unlikely to come from revisiting physical evidence alone. While forensic data is invaluable, trauma-informed analysis emphasizes emotional indicators, changes in behavior, inconsistencies in affect, patterns of control, and the timing of responses. These elements often reveal more than material clues when dealing with psychologically driven events. Trauma leaves imprints, even when bodies do not. It shapes how people move, speak, hesitate, or remain silent. Investigators trained in behavioral analysis increasingly recognize that absence itself of urgency, of concern, of coherence can be meaningful. Ultimately, the most unsettling aspect of Tiffany's case is not merely that she vanished, but how easily her fear went unnoticed. Her behavior was visible, yet its meaning was misread. Fear spoke through action, but no one listened closely enough to understand its language. When a person vanishes, responsibility is rarely singular. It is shared among relationships, institutions, and cultural blind spots. Tiffany's case reveals how fear often speaks quietly. When those signals go unrecognized, the result is not only unresolved truth, but the loss of a life acting in pursuit of survival. Tiffany Whitton is more than an entry in a missing persons file. Her story highlights the profound psychological toll of unaddressed abuse and the risks of minimizing emotional trauma. This case reflects a wider societal failure to recognize silent suffering warning signs that, when ignored, can escalate into isolation, disappearance, and irreversible loss. There are no definitive answers, only theories shaped by absence, silence, and uncertainty. The unresolved nature of this case forces us to confront uncomfortable realities about fear, control, and collective neglect. Violence does not always leave visible wounds. Sometimes its most enduring weapon is silence. If this story made you reflect, please like the video, share it with others, and subscribe for more in-depth explorations into criminal psychology and human behavior. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal